The world was quiet, but it was not a peaceful quiet. The wind carried dust and the smell of burned stone. Broken towers lay across the land like fallen giants. Nothing lived here anymore, except a few survivors who moved through the ruins. Lyra was one of them. Her people had once filled the skies with bright ships and the ground with shining cities. Now, all of it was gone, or had taken it away. She had nothing left but her own body, her form, and even that felt like it carried too much weight. She walked each day without knowing why. Food was hard to find, and trust was harder. One day, strange shapes came from the clouds, machines of silver and white. They landed on the flat plain outside the ruined city. Humans came out of them, wearing strong suits and carrying boxes. Lyra watched from a distance, hiding behind a broken wall. She had heard of humans. They'd come to other worlds before, offering help, but she had also heard they sometimes took more than they gave. The humans began to set up shelters and clean water stations. Other survivors came closer, curious but wary.
Iris
Stayed away. She had no reason to believe they would help her. She had no reason to believe anyone would. Among the humans was a man named Ethan. He had a calm way of moving, as if he had been to places like this before. He saw Lyra watching one afternoon. She was far away, standing near the shadow of a half-buried tower. Their eyes met for only a moment before she turned away. Ethan asked one of the translators about her, but no one knew her name. She kept to herself, never speaking to the others. Still, he noticed how thin she looked, and how she seemed to be walking slower every day. The next morning, Ethan carried a small bundle to the place where he had seen her. He left it on a rock, a water flask, a packet of dried fruit, and a piece of cloth to block the wind. Then he stepped back and waited. Lyra saw him from a distance. She waited for him to leave before walking to the bundle. She picked it up, sniffed the fruit, and drank the water. She looked around, but Ethan was already gone. This happened again the next day and the day after that. Ethan would leave something small, food, a tool, or clean water, and Lyra would take it. She never spoke, and she never thanked him. Still, she began to wonder why he was doing it. There was no reason for a human to care about her. Other survivors sometimes came to the human camp to ask for help. They traded small things for supplies, but Lyra stayed apart. She had learned long ago that taking help could lead to debts she could not pay. On the 5th day, Ethan came without a bundle. Instead, he stood where she could see him, holding a small piece of metal in his hand. He placed it on the ground and stepped back. It was a carving of a bird, shaped from scrap metal. Lyra hesitated, then walked forward. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. It was simple, but the bird's wings were open, as if ready to fly. She looked up at Ethan. For a long moment, they stood in silence. Then she put the carving in her pocket and walked away. She did not understand this human, and she was not sure she wanted to. But for the first time in many seasons, she felt something other than emptiness. That night, she sat by a broken wall, holding the metal bird. She thought of the humans camped outside the city. She thought of Ethan's quiet persistence. Maybe he wanted nothing from her. Maybe he was just someone who could not pass by without trying to help. The thought stayed with her, even as the wind howled through the ruins and the cold night closed in. The sun was pale the next morning as Lyra moved through the ruins. She kept the metal bird in her pocket, though she told herself it meant nothing. She had lived too long without trusting anyone. But the human named Ethan kept appearing in her thoughts. At the human camp, Ethan worked from sunrise to sunset. He fixed broken panels, lifted beams, and connected wires to bring power back to damaged shelters. The humans had brought machines to help, but they could not do everything. He often went into the ruins to see what could be repaired. One afternoon, Ethan saw Lyra again. She was trying to lift a heavy slab that had fallen across a doorway. Her movements were slow, and he could see she was tired. Without a word, he walked over and placed his hands on the slab. She froze for a moment, but did not move away. Together, they pushed until the slab shifted enough to slide aside. Lyra stepped back, breathing hard. She expected him to speak, but he only nodded and walked away. She felt an odd mix of relief and confusion. She had been ready to refuse help, yet she had not. The next day, Ethan left no bundle. Instead, he worked on a broken water pump near where Lyra stayed. She watched him from a distance, seeing how he tested the pipes, replaced broken seals, and cleared rust. He did not ask for anyone's help, but when water finally flowed, children from the nearby shelters ran to fill their cups. Lyra stayed in the shadows, though her eyes followed every movement. That night, she drank from the pump for the first time. The water was clean and cold. She did not want to admit it, but she was grateful. In the days that followed, Ethan began to greet her with a small nod whenever he saw her. He never came too close, and he never tried to force conversation. Sometimes he would leave tools in places she passed by, tools she could use to repair small things in the ruins. She began to use them, fixing door frames and patching holes in walls. The work was quiet, but it made her feel less useless. Once a young alien child from her settlement approached her while she was working. The child held out a small piece of bread. Lyra took it and broke it in half, giving a piece back. The child smiled before running off. She noticed Ethan watching from a short distance. He did not interfere, but his expression held something warm. One evening, a translator came to her with a message. Ethan wanted to know if she would help him repair a roof on one of the larger shelters. She almost said no, but the thought of refusing felt strange. She nodded. Working together was slow at first. They used simple hand signals and gestures. Ethan would point to a beam, and Lyra would hold it in place while he secured it. When wind threatened to knock the boards loose, they worked side by side without pause. By the time the roof was done, the sun was setting in gold and red. As they stood back, Ethan smiled. Lyra did not smile, but she felt something shift inside her. She had worked with another person for the first time in many seasons, and it had not been painful. As darkness fell, the human camp lit their lamps. Lyra walked back toward her place in the ruins, the metal bird still safe in her pocket. She thought about the day. She thought about the quiet way Ethan worked, never asking for thanks. She did not understand him, but she no longer believed he was here to take from her. The next morning, she found a small bundle near her wall again. It was not food or water this time. Inside was a thin piece of cloth, carefully folded. The color reminded her of the deep sky before nightfall. She held it in her hands for a long moment before placing it beside the metal bird. She did not know why she kept them, but she did. The air was heavy that week, and dark clouds hung over the ruins. Lyra woke one morning with a deep ache in her chest. Her throat was dry, and her head felt heavy. She tried to drink from the pump, but the water had a strange taste. By midday, her legs shook when she walked. She sat against a wall, closing her eyes. Distant voices came and went, but she did not move. The world around her felt blurred. Ethan noticed she was not at her usual spot. He asked a nearby child if they had seen her, and the child pointed toward the far edge of the ruins. Ethan found her leaning against the wall, her skin pale, and her breathing uneven. He crouched down and spoke softly, but she barely reacted. Without waiting, Ethan lifted his communicator and called for a small medical kit. The human camp was on the other side of the ruins, and the fastest path was through an area littered with unstable rubble. He knew it was dangerous, but he did not stop. He returned carrying water, a filter device, and some nutrient packs. He knelt beside her, setting the filter over the mouth of a flask. The water he poured through came out clear. He held it out to her. She hesitated before taking a slow sip. The cool liquid felt better than she expected. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. Ethan handed her a nutrient pack and motioned for her to eat. It was plain and soft, but she finished it slowly, stayed beside her until her breathing steadied. In the days that followed, Ethan checked the pump and found the problem. He worked long hours, replacing the damaged parts with what little the humans had brought. Lyra watched him, still weak, but able to stand again. She saw how he did not just fix the pump for her, but for everyone. When clean water flowed again, the settlement gathered to fill containers. Some smiled at Ethan, others kept their distance, but no one turned him away. Lyra filled her flask, then walked to where Ethan was packing his tools. She set the flask on the ground between them for a moment before picking it up again. It was the closest thing to a thank you she had given. The next morning, she found herself walking toward the human camp without knowing why. She stopped near the fence and saw Ethan repairing a generator. Sparks jumped from the wires, and the sound of metal on metal echoed in the air. She waited until he noticed her. He raised his head and she pointed to the tools he had been using before. He nodded and handed her one. They worked together for hours, replacing panels and testing the power lines. Though they spoke no common language, their hands moved in sync. By evening, the generator hummed steadily, sending light to the nearby shelters. The glow reached even into parts of the ruins. As they stood back, Lyra felt something she had not felt in many seasons. The sense that her actions mattered. She had helped make light for others. It was a small thing, but it was real. That night, she sat by her wall with the metal bird and the folded cloth. She placed them side by side, looking at them under the faint glow from the shelters in the distance. The sky was clear now, and the stars shone bright. She thought about the sickness that had nearly taken her, and how Ethan had come through the dangerous path to bring her clean water. She thought about the generator and how working with him had felt natural. She did not know what this meant for the future, but the emptiness inside her felt a little less sharp. When she closed her eyes, she realized she was already planning what repairs she might try tomorrow. The days grew warmer, and the settlement began to feel alive again. The repaired pump and working generator brought a small comfort to those who had stayed. But not everyone welcomed the changes. Whispers moved through the ruins about a group that did not want the humans there. They believed the humans would stay only until they had taken all they could, leaving the survivors weaker than before. Lyra heard these whispers as she worked on patching a cracked wall. She ignored them at first, but one evening she saw 3 figures near the generator moving in the shadows. They were not humans. They carried small tools and wires, and their movements were fast. She stayed hidden and listened. The group spoke in low voices, talking about shutting down the power so the humans would leave. She felt a pull inside her. She could walk away and pretend she had heard nothing. It was not her fight. But then she thought of the night the lights had first come on, how the shelters had glowed in the darkness. She left her hiding place and went straight to the human camp. Ethan was inside a tent, checking maps and equipment. She stepped in without speaking, picked up a piece of charcoal, and drew a quick outline of the generator. Then she marked where the figures had been. Ethan looked at the drawing, then at her, and understood. Within minutes, they were moving through the ruins together. Ethan carried a small light, which he kept low. Lyra led him to the generator. The figures were still there, one of them reaching into the open panel. Ethan called out sharply. The figures froze, then ran. One tripped over a loose cable, and Lyra blocked their path. She did not fight, but she stood firm. The others saw this and stopped. Ethan spoke calmly, telling them that destroying the generator would harm everyone, not just the humans. The group muttered but left without looking back. Ethan closed the panel and checked the wires. There was no damage yet, but he worked quickly to secure the controls, so they could not be tampered with again. Lyra held the light steady for him, her eyes scanning the shadows. When the work was done, they walked back to the camp in silence. At the edge of the fence, Ethan stopped and pointed to the shelters glowing in the distance. He said something she could not understand, but his tone was steady and warm. She nodded. The next morning, the story had spread. Some in the settlement now looked at Lyra differently. A few gave her small nods as she passed, quiet signs of respect. She was not sure how she felt about it, but she noticed her steps felt lighter. Later that day, Ethan found her repairing a doorway. He handed her a small pouch. Inside were a few strong nails, the kind she had not seen since before the war. She looked at them, then at him, and placed them carefully in her pocket with the metal bird and the cloth. As the sun set, the sky turned orange and gold. Lyra and Ethan stood by the pump watching the children fill their flasks. The wind was softer now, carrying the sound of quiet laughter instead of silence. She realized that working with Ethan had become part of her days, as natural as breathing. She still did not know what the future would bring. Maybe the humans would leave one day and maybe they would stay. But she understood something she had not before. She was no longer walking through the ruins alone. That night, she sat with the bird, the cloth, and the nails lined up before her. They were small things, but each held a piece of her days with Ethan. Each reminded her that even in a broken place, unexpected bonds could form and change the path ahead. The settlement had changed. Where there had once been only silence and ruin, there was now movement and the sound of work. The pump gave clean water, the generator sent light to the shelters. Broken walls had been patched, and the air no longer felt as heavy. Lyra stood at the edge of the human camp one morning, watching the people inside prepare for the day. Some repaired equipment, while others loaded small carts with supplies. She noticed Ethan speaking with another human near a table covered in maps. They both looked toward the settlement, pointing to areas that still needed repair. Later, Ethan walked over to her, carrying a rolled sheet of paper, opened it on a flat rock. It showed a simple plan for new shelters drawn in clear lines. He pointed to a section near the pump, then to her, then back to the plan. She understood. He was asking if she would help. For a moment she hesitated. Rebuilding something so large was more than she had done in many seasons. But then she remembered how it felt to see the lights come on for the first time. She nodded. The work began the next day. Humans and survivors worked side by side, passing tools and lifting beams. Some still looked at each other with caution, but the shared labor made the hours pass faster. Ethan worked close to Lyra, showing her how to join the wooden frames together. She showed him how to use pieces of broken walls as strong supports. Without words, they learned from each other. As days passed, the frame of the shelter rose. Walls took shape, and the roof began to form. Children watched from a distance, their laughter carrying on the wind. In the evenings, small fires lit the work area, and people shared simple meals together. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled in. Strong wind shook the half-built roof, and rain fell hard. Ethan shouted for everyone to secure the structure. Lyra climbed onto the frame, using rope to tie the beams, while Ethan held them steady from below. Water streamed down her face, but she kept working until the roof was safe. When the storm passed, the group stood together, wet but smiling. The shelter had held. It was a small victory, but it felt large in the hearts of those who had seen so much loss. A week later, the shelter was finished. It stood tall beside the pump, its roof strong, its walls firm. People gathered inside, sitting on the floor and talking in quiet voices. It was more than a building. It was a place where they could feel safe. That evening, Ethan found Lyra standing near her usual wall. He handed her a small object wrapped in cloth. When she opened it, she saw another carving. This one of two birds side by side, wings open as if flying together. She looked at it for a long moment before placing it with the first bird, the nails, and the sky-colored cloth. Ethan then pointed to the new shelter, then to her, then to himself. She understood. He was asking her to be part of the work that would follow. Not just repairs, but rebuilding the settlement piece by piece. She did not need to think long. She nodded. The next morning they began again. There were more walls to repair, more roofs to raise, and more lives to mend. Lyra no longer felt like a shadow moving through the ruins. She felt like someone who had a place and a purpose. As the sun set that day, she stood with Ethan near the pump. The sky turned deep gold, and the shelters glowed softly in the fading light. The wind carried the sound of children playing. Lyra looked at the scene and knew something had changed forever. She had once believed she had nothing left but her form. Now she had more. Not just objects or shelters, but a connection that had brought her back from the edge. It had come from a human who had done something she never expected, and it had given her the strength to start again.